So welcome back, everybody. So this week we will be covering the topic of feelings and how mindfulness skills can affect and even strengthen our management of our own feelings. So first I want us to reflect on the question of, do you treat yourself as someone deserving of self-care and validation of your efforts? Or do you tend to neglect yourself and withdraw from overwhelming feelings? So a lot of people are saying things like dwelling on their feelings, withdrawing from their feelings, stuffing their feelings down, feeling overwhelmed. Um, in the opposite sense, someone saying that they wear their heart on their sleeve, so their emotions are maybe right at the forefront and kind of always present. So through the next hour that we're together, we are going to dive into that idea of our feelings and how mindfulness skills can attend to those and maybe help us be better at managing them. Because again, when we're on either one of those spectrums there, where we either withdraw from them because we're too overwhelmed, or we are maybe too emotional in the sense that we're always feeling and it's always kind of taking us over. That's kind of lying on the two edges of that spectrum there, the two extremes. And so I'm sure most of us would want to lie more in the middle there, where we're able to acknowledge our feelings and be comfortable with talking about and dealing with our feelings, but not to the sense of feeling completely overwhelmed and also feeling too much at the same time. So to simply put it, I guess, our emotions are signals within our body that tell us when something is happening. So feelings are mental experiences or associations and reactions to an emotional signal. When something pleasurable is happening to you, you feel good. When something distressing is happening to you, you feel bad based on your own beliefs and experiences. So in many ways, your emotions are like an instant news service that gives you constant updates about what you're doing and what you're experiencing. Your initial reactions to what is happening to you are called primary emotions. So there are 8 primary emotions. We have anger, which can be fury, outrage, wrath, irritability, hostility, resentment, and violence. We can have sadness, so that can lead to grief or sorrow, gloom, melancholy, despair, loneliness, and depression. We can have fear, so that can lead to anxiety, apprehension, nervousness, dread, fright, and panic. We can feel joy, which is enjoyment, happiness, relief, bliss, delight, thrill, ecstasy. We can have interest, so acceptance, friendliness, trust, kindness, affection, love, and devotion. Surprise, which can lead to shock, astonishment, amazement, astounding, and wonder. We can have disgust, which is contempt, disdain, scorn, aversion, distaste, revulsion. And we can also have shame, so guilt, embarrassment, remorse, regret, and contrition. So these are strong feelings, our primary emotions. They're strong feelings that come on quickly, and they don't really involve any sort of thinking about what's happening. So for example, if you won a contest, you might instantly feel surprised. When someone you care about passes away, you quickly feel sad or lost. When someone does something that offends you, you might immediately feel angry. So, but in addition to experiencing those primary emotions that we have, so that kind of instinct reaction or that first reaction, it's also possible to experience secondary emotions. So these are emotional reactions to your primary emotions. So to put it another way, secondary emotions are feelings about your feelings. So there are different types of secondary emotional reactions that we can have. So one, you can feel discomfort or judgment about your primary emotion. So when you fail to validate your primary emotion as normal, reasonable, and even helpful, you will create a secondary emotion. For example, when you're hurt by somebody, you'll often turn this hurt into anger. And then you'll be dealing with the anger and actually avoiding the primary emotion of hurt. So sometimes it's helpful. And I tend to believe this is true a lot of the time with anger, that there's usually something else underneath it. Especially if it's something that you experience often, or have experienced multiple times. If you kind of tend to feel angry kind of quickly throughout the course of your day, usually there's something else there. There's something else underneath that anger, but you're attending to the anger and you're missing the actual feeling that's underneath it. And it's actually easier and better to deal with the hurt, for example, that might be underneath that anger, because that's what's really causing the anger to come up. So I think sometimes being curious about, hey, well, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? Does it actually match the situation, or is there something underneath it? And if there is something underneath it, can I tackle that instead of focusing on the anger or whatever other emotion came out in reaction to that secondary emotion? So we can also have it be that our secondary reaction emotions are evoked from your perceived identity. So if you assume that an event or behavior of another person says something about you, or your worthiness, your goodness, your value, your image, then emotions evoked from the event will be really intense. So if you realize that the event only says something about you, about the event, or the person / people involved, you might decrease the intensity of your reaction. So this is a big one too, right? When we experience situations where we feel that either the person or the situation is saying something about us, saying something about our worthiness, whether we're good enough, whether we're worthy of this experience, or our value or our image, these are really provoking situations that can create a lot of emotion. So if you're in a situation where you feel not good enough, what is your reaction to that? Are you feeling angry? And if so, are you actually feeling angry, or is it because you're hurt, or you feel embarrassed, or you feel shame? So again, being curious about our emotions can help us understand them better, and again, help us maybe target our approach in terms of understanding what emotion we have to deal with, rather than focusing on one and not really attending to the things that are kind of underneath it all. You can also experience intense emotions from the past. So intense emotions are stored memories. You can recall your emotional reactions to particular events, particularly intense emotions or traumatic events. And emotional memory can be triggered by present events that offer similar patterns or similarities to that past event. So if you stop avoiding your emotions and you experience them in the present, then old emotions lose their power and lower in intensity. So this one is particularly important in terms of talking about trauma and maybe childhood adversities or PTSD. The reason why those feelings are so intense is because we're reliving that memory. We're reliving those intense emotions that happened to us in the past in the present. But by acknowledging, and usually what comes along with trauma and PTSD, because of that sense of extreme overwhelm, is that we tend to be avoiders. We tend to stuff our feelings down. We tend to not go to that place, that emotional place, because it feels too much. It feels overwhelming. And I'm not saying to do this maybe on your own if you do have trauma and this is happening. This is an important work to be doing maybe with a professional, but by not acknowledging what's happening in the present, we're kind of making those past emotional memories even stronger, which then creates that present feeling of overwhelm even stronger as well. So we can also have emotions from assumptions you make about your world. So we all make assumptions about our lives and the world that we live in. So some are accurate, some maybe aren't. And either way, these assumptions either increase or decrease the intensity of our emotional experience. You think that everyone must approve of you, then every time you experience disapproval, you'll experience intense emotions. If you've learned that some people will disapprove and that's okay with you, your emotional state in the face of disapproval will be lessened. So again, by being curious about our beliefs and our values and what it is that we live, the way that we live our lives, the rules and kind of assumptions that we live our lives by, If we're curious about those, then we can maybe pinpoint patterns of behaviors or patterns of emotions that come up. So for example, if you have that belief, like I always have to be approved of by people, or I'm always seeking approval by others, then maybe you can recognize that when you do experience any sort of disapproval, that can lead to really big emotions that come up for you. But it's about maybe acknowledging, okay, well, is that an accurate, or is that a fair expectation or belief to have? And if it's not, can I adjust that view? Can I shift my perspective a little bit and maybe lessen the amount of overwhelm or difficulty I feel when maybe somebody does disapprove of me? So we can also have, this is our last one, we can also have emotions from your fear or anticipation of the future. So fear or anticipation about the future will intensify emotional states. So if you expect failure, evidence of problems will create intense emotions. If you expect success, the same evidence will create emotions that are less intense or immediate. So again, assessing where it is, what it is that your beliefs are, what it is that your expectations are, what it is that your thought process is. Because if you're not aware of how you're thinking about things, then you're really not attending to what's happening, and you're not able to recognize maybe when our own thought processes get in the way and make us even more emotionally charged than if we were just experiencing things in present time and not maybe giving so much power or so much weight to our thoughts. So an example of maybe in kind of lesser terms of a secondary emotion is, say you yell at your little sister because she did something that made you feel really angry. So this feeling of anger that comes on is quick, it's immediate, it's that first primary reaction. But like a little bit later, after you kind of have that instinctive anger and you kind of get really frustrated and maybe yell, later you might feel a little guilty for getting so angry at somebody. And this could be your little sister, it could be anybody. So anger was that primary emotion, and guilt is the secondary emotion. And I think most of us can maybe relate to this idea that typically when we do feel anger, especially if this is our primary emotion and our kind of initial reaction to a situation, oftentimes this is followed by either shame or guilt, embarrassment. We feel uncomfortable by our reaction. So that's our secondary emotion. And again, why do we feel that way? Is there something to be said about fixing that, or being curious about that emotion of anger, and what our beliefs are around anger? Because again, a lot of times anger is a really misunderstood feeling. It's one of those feelings that we tend to associate the most negative things with. But anger is just a feeling. We all experience it. It's not something to be feared or to be afraid of. It's the actions that anger can create, or the actions that are associated with anger, that we've come to fear, because anger is often associated with aggression or violence, when in reality, anger is just anger. It's a feeling, it's an emotion. We all experience it. But when we're not taught to deal with anger in a healthy way, then that's what we tend to fear the most. So can anybody reflect on a time when they may have experienced primary versus secondary emotions? And did they want to share that? I know for myself, and in particular, anger for me pops up a lot when I feel hurt. So it's like that defense mechanism, right? So I instantly feel angry, but underneath that anger, it's not really about anger at all. I'm not angry, I'm hurt. Or I feel unheard, or I feel unseen. So that is a very common pattern that I've noticed in my own life lately. And it's actually helped me to, when I recognize that, or I have recognized that, it's helped me be able to understand what's happening in the moment. And I'm getting better at identifying that secondary feeling, that hurt first, rather than kind of resorting to that anger. So maybe if we're still having a hard time identifying whether we've experienced a primary or a secondary emotion in any situation, there's some questions that might be helpful to ask yourself. So asking yourself the question, is this emotion a direct reaction to an external event? If it is, you're experiencing a primary emotion. Is the emotion becoming more intense over time? If it is, then that's a secondary reaction. and a secondary emotion. So again, then you can decide, okay, I have to be curious, well, what is that emotion that I'm actually feeling? Do you experience the emotion more frequently than the events that prompted the emotion? So if you notice that you experience this feeling in an array of different experiences, it's not just one experience that creates that. It's like an A to B scenario. It's more of a, you feel that feeling and it could be any situation, then that's likely a secondary emotion underneath there. When the initiating event receded, did those emotions recede? So if it was a very direct correlation between the event and the emotion, then once the event is over and the feelings about that are kind of slowly dissipating, it should kind of go together. And if so, then that's a primary emotion. Does the emotion continue long after the event and interfere with your abilities in the present and affect new and different experiences? So if so, that's a secondary emotion. So again, this is a good example of something where we have triggers from the past, right? Whether it be in a relationship or just in life, when we have events that have really hurt us in the past or caused us some sort of pain, and we carry those still, we still struggle with them. Whenever we're faced with a situation that might be similar to that or reminds us of that, then that can bring up those emotions, right? And that's a secondary emotion. And that's where we need to, again, do a little work and be curious more so about what that feeling is and why it is that you feel that way. And lastly, you can ask yourself, is the emotion complex, ambiguous, and difficult to understand? If you feel like you're trying to grasp at something and you can't really get to it, and it feels really, really big and complicated in your head, and it feels confusing to you, it's likely that your emotion that you're feeling is a secondary emotion there. A lot of people are talking about anger in the chat, and I appreciate the honesty and the vulnerability and being able to admit that, because again, anger can be one of those feelings that we struggle with, and especially struggle talking about and in maybe admitting that we feel, even though, like I said, anger is something that's universal. We all experience anger. And I think again, it's interesting to maybe reflect on, is this anger the primary emotion, but is there something underneath it? Is there a secondary emotion there that's continuing, that's, I guess, like, what's the word I'm looking for? The secondary emotion that's kind of propelling that feeling that anger to continue, I guess. So, have you ever noticed that you often don't know what you feel? Do you sometimes feel like you've been walking around in this emotional fog, knowing that you feel bad or upset, but not being able to really name the emotion that you're feeling? If you don't know what emotion you're feeling, it's really hard to do anything about that emotion or to help yourself tolerate it. Once you can put a name on that emotion, you can often figure out what to do about it. Or perhaps it's not about knowing what to do about it, but rather your feelings make you so uncomfortable that when you see them as negative and as something that makes your life worse, then that enhances that emotion. It makes it more intense. Some of us may come from a background where it wasn't appropriate to show our feelings. We were told to suck it up, or just get over it, or only babies cry, or it's weak to cry, it's weak to show emotion. Perhaps you've been told that you're too much or too sensitive when you show your emotions, which has created the belief that your emotions are not acceptable, so you shouldn't allow yourself to feel them. Does anyone relate to that idea of maybe the things that we've been told in our lives about our feelings, about emotions, that maybe create barriers in the present to being able to acknowledge them and help yourself through them? It's unfortunate. I guess I can relate to that idea too, of being told I'm too much, or I'm too sensitive, or I feel too much, and it's like, but I'm a human. You feel the same things I feel, right? And it's one of those things that it's really unfortunate that we're so averse to emotions and so averse to feelings, when in reality they're just part of our experience. They're just giving us cues to things that we need to work through or work on. And it really does create this sense of shame around our feelings, that we don't necessarily have control over all the time. You can't control what your feelings are. Your feelings are just feelings, and that's okay. You're allowed to have a feeling about something. But when you're constantly told that you can't, that can lead to a lot of shame or embarrassment, or maybe even feelings of guilt about having feelings. And it's just, it really mutes you and silences how you're actually feeling and invalidates your just normal everyday human experience. So for whatever reason that your beliefs have developed, for whatever experiences you've gone through, or things that you've heard over the course of your life that have made you have certain beliefs about feelings, the beliefs that we have can really shape how we cope with them. So can anyone relate to the idea of having any of the following beliefs? I can't stand this. It's unbearable. I hate this feeling. I must stop this feeling. Please take it away. I can't cope with this feeling. If I acknowledge this feeling, I will lose control. It's weak to feel this way. I'll go crazy if I allow myself to feel my feelings. This feeling will go on forever. It's bad to feel this way. It's wrong to feel this way. Does anyone relate to saying those things maybe to yourself? So again, whether or not your beliefs developed because of experiences that you had as a child, or maybe how you were taught to deal with emotions, or how your parents dealt with your emotions, or their own emotions, when you have these beliefs of these, I can't stand this, I can't cope with this, I don't want to feel this, though all those things, again, in essence, it really does just amplify the feeling and intensify it, because when you don't acknowledge your feelings, it has nowhere to go. It has to simmer there under the surface rather than being released. And oftentimes it's almost like we talked about that paradox earlier, I think in week 1, where when we stuff things down, it becomes a pressure cooker. We feel that if we don't deal with it, if we avoid it, if we say we can't cope with it, that'll push it away and we won't have to deal with it. But in reality, that actually makes it worse. And we have to cope with it eventually, and sometimes in bigger ways than that first initial emotion was felt, right? So if we push it down, it becomes bigger and bigger, and then it becomes more overwhelming to deal with. So it's almost like this vicious cycle there. So the more strongly you hold these kinds of beliefs of, I can't stand this, I hate this feeling, I can't cope with it, the more likely that you will be bothered by your feelings and want to get rid of them. When we can't tolerate our feelings and believe that we can't cope, then this leads to even more discomfort and then trying to escape or avoid dealing with them. And this can also often lead to maybe unhealthy coping skills when we are faced with big emotions because we're scared to deal with them, or we don't know how to deal with them in an appropriate way because we were never taught to. And so that can lead to, using substances to cope. It can be using distractions to cope, and it can lead to really unhelpful patterns of behavior. So being in touch with your feelings can actually help you surf that wave of being of that mindful feeling, so mindlessness, and can lead you to mindfulness. So emotions add color to our lives, yet we don't often notice them until they either bring us pleasure or pain. So bringing mindful awareness to our emotions can help us learn how to notice them and label them appropriately. So again, when we live on those extremes there, and we only often notice intense joy or intense sadness or pain, then we're not noticing the full range of and capacity of emotions that we have. We're living in those extremes and we're not able to notice just the simple, maybe fleeting emotions, maybe more neutral emotions that we feel on a daily basis. So labeling your emotions can help appreciate those pleasant moments. It can help you be curious and open to unpleasant experiences, and can even help you notice maybe neutral events that don't really create any sort of strong feeling, and that we often overlook. So again, those may be neutral moments where we're not really feeling anything at all. That again, if we're operating from the assumption that we only experience intense pleasure or intense pain, so we may not be feeling anything in particular, but there's still feelings there, and they're still valid. But yet we overlook them because they're not those kind of two extremes. So emotions are electrical and chemical signals in your body that alert you to what is happening. These signals often begin in your senses, using sight, touch, sound, smell, and taste. And then the signals travel to your brain where they're processed in an area called the limbic system, which specializes in observing and processing emotions so that you can respond to emotional situations. The limbic system is also connected to the rest of your brain and body, so it can tell your body what to do in response to an emotional situation. So your emotions are an extremely important thing that happens in your body, chemical signal that happens in your body for many reasons, but in particular for survival. So another important thing to remember about emotions is that they're there for a reason. They all have their job, they all have a purpose. So whenever you experience an emotion, it's there to try and tell you something. For example, anger often comes up to motivate us to work towards change when there's something that we don't like about a situation. Anxiety comes up when there's something that could be dangerous to us, and it motivates us to leave the situation or to protect ourselves and so on. Sometimes people become more emotionally sensitive, which means their emotions get triggered more often than they need to. You might find that you get angry over something that seems pretty small, that normally wouldn't bother you, or maybe you feel anxious in a situation where there really isn't anything that's threatening you. Still, you can usually see why the emotion has come up in you and in our bodies, even if it might seem like maybe an overreaction or that the event doesn't warrant the feeling that's coming up. So the point is that we're not trying to get rid of the emotions that you feel. We need them, they're important. But instead it's about being able to manage them more effectively and not let them control you. So again, if we're not aware of them, if we're not thinking about them at all, if we're actively saying, you know what, I don't want to deal with that, I can't deal with that, then what you're saying there is that they're not important. I don't want to deal with them. And so if you're not even thinking about them, then how are you going to be able to manage them and not let them control you? So in some sense, by acknowledging your feelings, you are taking back the power and the control over them. So as we explore the full range of emotions we experience, we can practice fostering a welcoming attitude to all of them, even the ones that we might prefer to go away. So in this way, we learn to welcome all experiences in our guest house of our awareness, knowing that they will take up residence for only a temporary period of time, and they may have something to teach us. So if we can allow our emotions to come into our consciousness, we welcome them in, and we say, hey, let's go, let's acknowledge these things, let's talk about them. And again, understanding that even though it feels intense, even though it feels overwhelming, it's temporary. It's not going to stay here forever. Our emotions are not forever. We fluctuate in our emotions day to day, week to week, and it just depends on what's going on. There's lots of factors that affect it. So our emotions are always temporary. And they only reside in our guest house, in our consciousness for a certain amount of time. And they have something to teach us. They're trying to tell us something. So there's a saying that if you name a thought or emotion, you can tame it. If you name it, you can tame it. So turning towards difficult emotions can make them less intense and more manageable. Labeling helps us step out of that ruminating mind where we kind of play it over and over in our heads, and we notice what is happening in the present and become more accepting of the full range of our emotions. So when we don't label it, when we just allow these situations or these feelings to just kind of run around on us, then we're not in control of them. We're not able to tame it. When we name it, when we say, hey, I'm feeling really sad right now, and we get curious, well, why am I feeling sad? And kind of go through the scenario, go through your day, and you figure out what it is that maybe brought on this feeling. Maybe there's some certain thoughts that you're having. Maybe there was a moment that you experienced earlier in the day. Maybe there's a disagreement, or maybe someone said something to you that you just feel uncomfortable with, right? So there's always a reason, but if we don't acknowledge it, or if we're not willing to go there, and we're not willing to talk about our feelings, then we're never going to be able to understand where they came from. So labeling can really help us. And it seems so simple to be I'm just feeling really sad today. It seems so simple to say that out loud, but yet it's really effective. Because again, once we're able to label it, it seems less big, it seems less scary, And then we're able to acknowledge maybe what's going on around that feeling and can kind of delineate maybe where it came from. So research has actually found that that simple act of naming an emotion can actually calm the emotional centers in the brain. So if you can remember last week, I think it was last week or the week before, where we had that diagram of the brain. And when we experience threat, when we experience overwhelm, our rational brain shuts off and we're living in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, that emotional center of our brain. And that's sending signals to our body to act defensively, to be ready to fight. It sends out those physical symptoms of maybe anxiety or anger, when kind of that heart pounding, that anxiety, sweating, kind of shaky feeling. But when we're able to acknowledge our feelings, to label it, to name it, that actually is a great way of calming down that emotional center of the brain, bringing back your rational brain online, and it helps you be able to cope with and manage those feelings a little bit easier. So we can learn to ride the wave of those intense emotions by developing language to label our emotions and observing their intensity. So using the stop technique, this is by Goldstein, to help you pause throughout the day and recognize your emotions, the emotions you're experiencing. When we're able to stop, then we're better able to learn to master and have control over our feelings. So stop, it stands for, the S is stop and take a pause. That T is for take a breath. That O means observe. So observe what you notice, what's going on for you, what feelings are coming up, what physical sensations are coming up. And then that P is to proceed with the rest of your day. So in some senses, it's a very quick method to say, you know what, I'm acknowledging this. I'm going to take a minute for it and allow it, but I'm not going to let it take over the rest of my day and kind of whitewash the rest of my afternoon with this one emotion. I understand that my emotions are temporary. I'm going to feel tons and tons of them over the course of the day. And this is just the feeling I'm feeling right now in this moment. And then I can allow myself to almost let it go, and acknowledge that it was there, and then proceed with the rest of my day. This doesn't mean that you never go back to it. If this is an emotion that's a big emotion and it was really difficult, perhaps there's still something there that needs to be looked at, and that's okay. But allowing yourself to give yourself a break from it and say, hey, I can't attend to this right now. I've observed it, I've named it, I've labeled it, but I'm going to let it go for now, because I'm maybe at work and I don't have the space or the time or the safety to deal with this, and I will deal with it later. That's where that kind of emotional intelligence comes in, and that better management of your emotions comes in, because there are certain situations where we don't have the space to deal effectively with our emotions in the moment, and because of whatever reason. And so we need to be able to feel the feeling, allow the feeling to come in, but then not dismiss it, but put it on pause, stop it for a second, and come back to it at a time where we do have the space to be able to deal with it or to really dive into it. Okay, so there's two questions that came in the chat. One being tips on understanding why a really happy experience can trigger anxiety, and that feeling maybe that we feel guilt for being too happy. I think that comes in, again, I guess I would ask you to be curious about why it is that you feel happy, that you feel guilty about being happy. What beliefs do you have about being happy? What have you been told about being happy and being too happy? And maybe there's something to be said underneath that of maybe there's beliefs about lack of worthiness. I don't deserve to be this happy, or it could be something to do with maybe not having enough self-compassion for yourself to say, I'm allowed to be happy. I'm allowed to feel these feelings. It's good to feel this way. So again, just being really curious about where that anxiety is coming from, what beliefs are kind of attached to happiness for you. Have you been told that you're not allowed to be too happy, that happy is too much, or there's probably beliefs there that maybe you have to attend to. That are creating that sense of guilt or that sense of anxiety when you feel that sense of happiness. We also have a question about what if you have difficulty labeling emotions because you don't know them? And that's a very, very good question. In our workbook this week, there should be an emotion wheel. So it has a list of tons and tons of feelings, and it categorizes them in those kind of primary emotions. So those happy, sad, glad, mad, scared, all those things, interest, disgust, all those things. So you should, if you go through that, start to go through the list, go through the emotion wheel. And maybe it might be a good exercise to try and pick out an emotion on the wheel and think of a scenario where you've felt that feeling. So again, you've definitely felt all the feelings and the emotions, but it might not, it just might be that you don't have the literacy, or you haven't had the literacy before to be able to label it. But that doesn't mean that you that you've never experienced it or that you don't know. You just have to get the words to explain the situation that you felt, I guess. So that's just a matter of again, reading through those emotions, understanding, maybe even doing some research on understanding what situations other people have felt in terms of maybe feeling disgust or feeling sad, and then going from there. So if we think about learning to ride a bike, it probably took us a few unsteady attempts and a few falls before we gained our balance. So even when we get our balance, you may still feel unsteady when traveling over new ground or on different surfaces. So in the same way, different situations or times in your life may be more challenging and may require extra effort and persistence. So you may have to challenge your biased expectations or challenge your negative self-evaluations. You may have to have more intentional self-care. You may have to pay more attention to positive qualities and validating your own efforts, and also experimenting with your behaviors a little bit more often, depending on the situation that you're in. Nobody is perfect at managing their emotions. No one is perfect at acknowledging their emotions and validating their own experiences. And again, based on what's going on in the moment, based on the experiences that you're having, it's going to vary how well you're good or how well you can manage those feelings. So again, there's lots of factors that affect how we cope with our feelings. And sometimes, you know, if things are really stressful, really overwhelming, there's lots of external factors that are affecting how you feel that can really change and affect how we cope with our feelings. And that doesn't mean that you're not good at coping with them, or that you that you're kind of slipping into old patterns or whatever that kind of belief might be. It's just that we have to have compassion with ourselves in terms of our emotions, because again, there's lots of different factors that affect those things, and we're not going to be perfect at it every time, and that's not the goal. The goal isn't to be perfect at managing our feelings. The goal is to just be open to those experiences, be open to our feelings and not stuff them down. So allow our feelings to move through. So even after a lot of practice, there still may be times when you think you've slipped back and had a setback, and you might feel a little bit more off balance than usual. And that's okay. This is a normal process, right? We can't, like I said earlier, we can't be perfect at managing our emotions all the time. So this also comes along with that idea, especially in terms of riding a bike, that developing new skills is never a smooth process. You're always being faced with new challenges and different situations that we have to apply these skills in. And there's several reasons that ripples that might come up. There may be an increase in physical or mental stress. So when we feel physically and mentally stressed out, that makes it really hard for us to cope with our emotions in maybe a helpful way. And again, that's not because of any failing on your part. It's just that it requires more attention. It requires more conscious effort, more active effort to cope with our emotions in times of increased stress than it does maybe on a day-to-day basis. So just like riding a bike over kind of maybe bumpy surfaces in the woods with like roots and rocks and all those things, mental and physical stress can create new challenges and new ways of thinking and behaving that you developed, and you may end up going back into old habits. But that's not to say that you failed or that you're not good at it, or you've tried and you're not doing well. It just means that, you know, you've experienced a bump in the road, and you just have to kind of pick yourself back up and say, you know what, I do have new skills here that I've developed that can help me navigate this new terrain in a different way than I did before. When we're physically unwell, so if we're ill, if we have any sort of disease, then we're less likely to have mental or physical energy required to navigate challenges, or again, experiment with our negative thoughts, or challenge our belief system, and to treat ourselves well, or to think about our positive qualities. So again, the situation of being ill or having disease or being faced with something like that can really interfere with the positive aspects of using mindfulness and using mindful attention to attend to our emotions. We're not going to be able to do that as effectively if we're physically unwell. So it can be really helpful to remind yourself that, you know, you're human. Most people have down days, or there's days where life's stresses and hassles are harder to deal with. It's all part of that journey. We can use these ripples or these challenges or these setbacks or bumps in the road as a way of learning something new about ourselves, and this can help us avoid maybe similar problems in the future. So it's not always a negative thing to experience a setback or a bump in the road. These bumps just help us navigate future bumps and help us strengthen our resolve in understanding our emotions and practicing the skills and actually applying the skills that we've learned into real situations. So this is just a reminder for everyone today as we wrap up that you're doing the best that you can right now. And you should be really proud of yourself for the accomplishments that you've achieved so far in relation to developing more mindfulness skills. This is a skill that takes a lot of time and patience and practice to develop. It's not going to happen overnight, and that's not expected of anyone. So it's about being kind to yourself, again, in moments where it might be challenging, and trust that you do have the skill set to back yourself up, and you're learning and developing these skills over time that can help you manage these things better in the future. But you're doing the absolute best that you can right now. And I'm really proud of everyone, one, just for showing up and being here and participating. And I hope that you're noticing, I guess, maybe shifts in your life, or you're being able to practice these skills in real life, and just kind of, it's just a day-by-day thing, and just about practicing and kind of taking that information in and applying it into your regular life. So that's all I have for us today. I'm going to welcome any questions for the next 12 minutes, 12, 13 minutes or so. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know. I'm more than happy to answer any. Yeah. Okay. So secondary emotions, again, they're feelings about our feelings. They're feelings about our feelings. So when we look at this list here, so feeling ashamed when you get angry, or feeling angry when you feel shame. Or again, feeling angry when you feel hurt. So it's that feeling that we get that's underneath that first feeling or that first reaction that we have, that's spurring on that reaction. So again, going through that list there of different types. And again, our workbook really goes into depth more about primary and secondary emotions. So if you download, I don't know if it's a download, if you copy that link, or if it might have been in your email, but if you grab that workbook, it goes into detail more, and it gives you kind of a solid copy of these things. So you can go through that on your own time and just have a physical copy of it. So I think one of the questions that's popping up is just, or not questions, but just statements, is understanding what we could say to ourselves to help diffuse the emotions and help move on from it. So again, if we go to that stop, I think the first thing I would say is to just label the emotion, name it. Right? That's the first step. So if we name it to ourselves, and again, it sounds so simple, right? To just say, oh, like I'm feeling really upset right now, but upset isn't the right feeling, right? Really identify it. Choose the exact word that fits. And again, once you can label that, then you decide, okay, I need to stop. I need to take a breath. I need to observe what I'm feeling. Is it causing physical reactions? Is it causing certain thoughts to come up? And when you're observing that, again, that comes along with that labeling piece. And then say to yourself, okay, I feel this way. I feel sad. I feel hurt. I feel disappointed. I feel angry. I feel ashamed. Whatever emotion that you labeled, it's making me feel shaky. It's making my heart pound. It's making my muscles feel tense. It's making me think maybe critical thoughts of myself. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. Whatever you can notice, and then decide, okay, I don't have the space right now. I'm at work. I can't talk about this. I can't go into detail with this now. So I'm going to let it go for now. And I'm going to go on with the rest of my day. And then I'll come back to it later. I'll either journal about it. I'll talk about it with a friend. I'll dive into it a little bit more when I get home. So that's kind of a way to kind of cope with or deal with something in the moment that can help you diffuse it and move on from it. It's not to say that you won't feel it for the rest of the day, but it just allows you to take some space from it. And again, when you label it, it really does, it's crazy to say, but it really does stop all that physical stuff. It really does, it calms you, and it's like, oh, that's what I'm feeling. And I guess you just have to practice that and experience it for yourself. So the question coming in through about controlling feelings of anger towards somebody that you can't seem to forgive. I think it's about, one, acknowledging again, is this a feeling? Is this the primary feeling, or is it a secondary feeling? I would imagine that it's probably a secondary emotion because the situation that prompted the anger in the first place is now over. That's in the past, but yet you still feel angry and you still feel this sense of not being able to forgive them. So again, what secondary emotion is coming up for you that's causing this anger? And again, are you attending to the right feeling? Is it anger, or is there something underneath it that's causing you to feel upset towards this person? It's also helpful maybe to notice that forgiveness isn't about accepting bad behavior or allowing bad behavior. Forgiveness is for yourself. Forgiveness is to say, you know what, this happened. It hurt me. It caused me pain, but I'm going to forgive you because I don't want to live with this anymore, and I don't want to keep carrying it forward. It doesn't mean I'm saying that it was okay. It doesn't mean I'm saying it was right. It just means that I forgive it and I'm choosing to move forward from it. And again, I think if you become curious about maybe where that anger is coming from and what emotions are really underneath it, I think that'll help you be able to forgive and be able to not think about it all the time, because right now you still don't understand it. And so that's why you're thinking about it all the time, because it's a secondary emotion that it's still coming up and kind of rippling through the rest of your life. So workplace emotions, that's an interesting concept. Oh, that's a tough one. It's difficult when you feel as though your superior, your manager, your supervisor is dismissing or pushing your emotions aside. That's not a good feeling. That doesn't feel good, and you feel invalidated by that. Um, I think part of that will come from validating your own experiences. Um, in terms of acknowledging that you feel the way that you do for a good reason, that you're not overreacting, that you're not you're not being silly for having those feelings. So validating yourself in those feelings, and not looking, I guess, for just validation from your manager to acknowledge the feelings that you're having, and then going from there. Maybe there's something to be said about talking to your manager about how you're feeling about this and how it made you feel when they pushed it aside. If you feel comfortable and able to do that. It is a tricky one though, because in essence, a person that is in some ways has power over you and control over your schedule and your work life, and is supposed to be there to manage you and your colleagues and the experiences that you're having at work. When they're not validating that, it can be really hurtful. Yeah, I feel for you. That's definitely, I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that feeling. and it's not an easy one to work through, but I think your manager probably just struggles to cope with those feelings too. And so likely has a hard time acknowledging them for you and your colleagues. Can you have the same primary emotion and secondary at the same time? I don't think that they would be the same. No, they wouldn't be. If you feel anger, it's likely that anger, there wouldn't, if it's the same emotion, it's not secondary. It's just that primary emotion. A secondary emotion is a different one. It's a feeling about your feeling. So it would be different from the primary emotion. But you can experience primary emotions and secondary emotions at the same time. They just wouldn't be the same feeling. They would be two separate feelings. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than able to answer. But if otherwise, you're free to head out. Thank you for being here today. I hope that everyone has a good rest of their week, and I hope to see you all next week for week 6. But otherwise, take care, and I hope everyone has a great week this week.